Hi and welcome to this episode of my world building podcast. If you haven't listened to the first entry, I suggest you go ahead and do so because that is where I explain the creative premise underlying this whole project. Since then I decided on a format for these episodes. There will be entries from a fictional historical atlas of the Pelaise, the cultures of my world, and thus one form of stories to tell about them. And today's first episode will be on the realm of Kushumer and its conquest from bay to bay, which you can see depicted in the map. So here we go. Let me tell you about Kushumer of old, cradle of civilization, first house of mankind. It is a tale of a realm older than every other. Kushumer in the heroic age stands at the end of 1,000 years of tradition, many of which are not transmitted in writing and thus were forgotten even by the Kushumeri of later days. What is left now are monuments, myths, and, as I heard say, the oldest Pelaise of all, remnants of a time older than history itself, a time in which humans lived as one with nature, and animals would still be allowed to imprint their minds on the Pelaise, something now considered a monstrosity in all lands I have heard of. The Kushumer were among the first people to come together in large groups and work together to make nature their own. They dwelt near a fertile bay, now named Kushumer after the great city, lands they were ever cautious to defend against nomadic tribes in the western and southern inlands, and against rival cities along the coast. We must imagine the old realm as a mighty city in permanent strife with its neighbors, and the Kushumeri were among the first to build temples of stone with painted walls and golden banners. It is said that many of the great monuments built during the time of the old realm have lasted through the ages, yet of many we know not for what purposes they were built. What we do know, however, is that one of these strange constructs was home to a ritual that the Kushumer called Nepesha. It is possible indeed that this ritual was older than the city of Kushumer itself, that it was born as a gathering of tribes to pass on the important tales and accounts of their age and to negotiate and plan where to move with their herds of cattle. The sacred ground to host these rituals would first have been home only to shamans small in number. But in later days, when the Kushumer had begun to sow crops and build monuments of stone, it was here where they first would crown a king, a chief to rule the tribes. The city of Kushumer may thus have been a child to the ritual its people called Nepesha. In its old form, the Nepesha demanded that the shamans of Kushumer gather the many beings of the cosmos, humans, animals, and gods, in a monument. In fact, the name that the Kushumer gave to living beings was listeners, or those that can be invited, that is, those which are part of a cosmic resonance of calling and answering, and the totality of these conversations could be listened to in the Nepesha. For this, the shamans would unite with animals and gods in a ceremony using a pelai, so as to read the moods and wills of the cosmos and to foresee weal and woe that the gods had prepared for their people. And whether in sickness they heard the calling and answering of spiritual beings, the wind howled, the sea roared, and so forth. After having so conversed with all the beings of the cosmos, sacrifices and appeasements were brought, depending on what had been heard, to ensure fertility, health, and peace. Then everything that was a part in the ritual, and everyone indeed, was burned, even the shamans and other humans. This may seem a strange and maddening idea to us now, but for the shamans of old Kushumer, this burning meant to transform oneself and thus send a reply to the cosmos of beings. To bring this about, the smoke rising from the ritual burning was blown through a musical instrument. This instrument, however, was nothing else than the monument itself. I imagine these monuments must have been built in some fashion capable of producing sounds from the rising smoke. We therefore know the purpose of at least this kind of monument. These temples were voices of human communities. A second pillar of the becoming of Kushumeri culture was the advent of the calendar. The calendar was not numerical at first, had neither months nor seasons, but listed beings that started calling on that day, so it had a day of the bee. I suppose you could see it as a list of guests to the Nepesha. At first, images were drawn of these beings and later symbols that would make up the Kushumeri writing system, which was passed to the Samese and finally inspired the Emerile script. What matters is that for the Kushumer there was a meaning in nature, in every being that could be expressed in symbols. Midsummer was the day of the divine, and solstice was reserved for humans, since in summer the gods are with mankind, while in winter they leave them on their own. I presume the calendar was used first to determine the appropriate time for the Nepesha, though I know not on which day that was. perhaps on the day of the gods or before crops were sowed, or perhaps on less certain days when the Kushumer were still a wandering people. What I do know is that the various calendar signs were of high significance for the families of Kushumer, each of them using a version of their ancestor's sign as a seal for important documents, and their children were given names in accordance with the calendar sign, pertinent to the day of their birth. Children born on midsummer or solstice were believed to be destined for great deeds. Prophecies, I presume, were often fulfilled as these children were held in high honor from the day of their birth. As many know, the old realm of Kushumer would fall before long and make way to the new realm, a realm far more powerful, which they think of when hearing the name. What few know, however, is that this upheaval was brought about in parts by the calendar the Kushumeri had invented. We may call this a calendar revolution. I mentioned that the calendar was used by the Kushumeri shamans to guide their union with the cosmos, the Nepesha. And so after a while, a hidden art of the calendar emerged when priests started asking for a hidden order in nature, believing that each being, having a meaning in the calendar, had a distinct role to play in the order of things. The calendar was thus believed to represent the order of the cosmos itself. The role of humans in this order was to bring all beings together in the Nepesha. This thought, harmless at first, was a tremendous one, for it brought about a metaphysical revolution, a departure from the idea that humans, animals, and gods are the order of cosmos, towards the idea that there is a cosmic order hidden behind things, and beings have a distinct place in that order, and in the case of humans, a privileged access to listen and answer to it, to understand it and fulfill its demands. What name this new class of priests gave to itself has not outlasted the ages, but they were spoken of as the keepers of hidden knowledge, and they demanded ever more fiercely that this knowledge should not be burned foolishly in the Nepesha, but passed on, grown, and preserved. In fact, they believed to follow a demand that the cosmic order had imposed on them, the demand that human society and the world it presided over should resemble the cosmic order, with the keepers to provide the guidance and understanding it needed to be molded and nurtured in the predetermined way. At that point, I presume these priests set their minds on being more than just spiritual advisors, but instead started to aspire the rule over Kushumer as mandated to instate natural order and lead the discovery of it. In later days, this belief was no insignificant force in Kushumer. The oddity was that the calendar, which they understood to be the circle of the universe, had 360 days. Thus each year failed to conform to it by just a few. The priests read this as a sign that the world was not yet in order, and in the new realm they had refined their calendar to 6 cycles of 60 days, believing that the world had equally 6 ages of 60 generations, of which they had Kushumer made out to be in the 4th age, but preparing for the 5th. There was a strange pressure on the Kushumeri of later days to be a force productive to the coming of the 5th age, and not a counterforce, which was a widespread condemnation. But I digress. In any case, at first I imagine these priests would conspire in secret ways if they were aware of their aspirations at all. But from this point on, the human relation to the divine was tied to their mandate to rule over the cosmos, to be masters of nature. Soon, new forms of monuments were built to resemble the calendar, the cosmic order, and the priests performed the Nepesha without sacrifices and with a mere symbolic presence of other beings as achieved through a calendar and writing system. The ritual was then performed to pass on the hidden knowledge of the cosmos, and with this change to the Nepesha, a new creed was born. The ritual thus turned from a central cosmic union to an empty tradition, and it was no longer honored in the new realm. With it, the Pelaisi also became less important for the Kushumer, and they were repurposed for other things we know not of. The keepers of hidden knowledge, however, flourished in all parts of Kushumeri society. They were the only ones instructed in the art of the calendar, which meant writing, and step by step they assumed all kinds of roles that benefited from this craft. The calendar thus became an instrument of power in their hands, which is why I called their ascent the calendar revolution. It spawned the birth of bureaucracy and traditions of experts that paved the way for the cultural, economic, and military achievements that would give the new realm the strength to dominate its world. With the effort of the keepers to preserve their various forms of knowledge, a written intellectual history begins as well, so I may see myself, whether I like it or not, as standing in their footsteps. The new realm finally begins with the palace revolution, but this was mostly a formality. From that time on, the old rivalry of tribes was overlooked by a class of priests, though the new realm retained the court rivalry among tribes as it coupled the benefits of power to the possession of offices in its new bureaucracy. While the shamans were originally selected from chosen individuals relying on special omens, the keepers of the new realm were chosen from powerful tribes and instructed in their various doctrines. At their top stood the Mehala. He has since been called an emperor or high priest, and some rulers name themselves after him to this day, but to do justice to the way the Kushumer thought of him, I believe he's better described as an architect of human society and ruler of the natural world, and so mandated by the cosmos. His name, translated to Emerile, means he who listens to all, and his court was the gathering and invitation of all listeners, a permanent ritual to replace the Nepesha for good. During the time of the New Realm, Kushumer finally turns from a rather open culture that coexists with its regional neighbors into an hungry empire that sees itself as the realm destined to bring every being under its order, revered and feared by foreign rulers, though appreciated by many who can firstly appeal to a common law, although it clearly favored the ruling bureaucracy. The word of the keepers was law, but it was published as edicts, and the keepers were obsessed with assigning everything and everyone a clear function, a clear place in their cosmic order. At that time, Kushumer had long won the upper hand in its strife against its closest neighbors, and its masters ruled over Shuwara and Elapur to the north, the fortress of Tireya to the west, and Ibana at the sea. The realm thus ushered in the first great expanse among the realms of men, the conquest from bay to bay. So called as the realm of Kushumer was first spread to the Meheshani Sea, conquering the eastern regions of Bereshan and Kuliwani, and soon swallowed the realm of the Achamidase, reaching the Western Sea as well. The Mehala and the keepers thus ruled over the first great empire, but they looked back at 1,000 years of history and an old creed that they had left behind. In their new realm, rival religions were suppressed, but for reasons I know not of, they showed not much interest in the Pelaisi, so the rituals performed with these could live on, and the Pelaisi were passed on, so that some of these artifacts now give glimpses into a time of long forgotten cults and cultures, into a time before the advent of writing, astrology, chariots, and monumental architecture. And while the keepers showed little concern for the Pelaisi, it is hard to imagine the empire of Kushumer without them, and the Nepesha, and the tale of how the keepers forgot their origins over a grand vision. I suppose you could say the Kushumeri conquered heaven before they conquered earth.